Pixelkino is a German-language podcast about video games based on movies, and movies based on video games. We recently had the opportunity to talk with Rex Bradford, the programmer of the first official Star Wars video game. Parker Brothers released The Empire Strikes Back in 1982 for the Atari 2600. This is an extended cut of our interview with Rex, who shares insights on the development of the game and his career.
Rex, how are you, and what do you remember about that time? How did you get in a position to program that rather prestigious title?
Sure. Very nice to chat with you, and a lot of luck. I went to college not majoring in computer science. There wasn't even a degree at the college I went to. This is back in the mid-'70s. But I was a psychology major, and my professor said, if you're ever going to go to graduate school, you should know something about computers. And so I took a computer programming course, which they did have, and really got into it. And then got lucky that the same advisor had a lab that I got a job in, and I basically taught myself programming there on mini computers, and then some of the first Kromemco microcomputers back in the late 70s. And then after, I actually stayed on working there a couple of years after college, but it decided eventually that working in a psychology lab for almost no money wasn't going to work forever. And so I started looking for jobs in the Boston area, which was not too far afield, and didn't really get much, as self-taught, and, it was a little hard. And then all of a sudden I saw, this is back when jobs were advertised in newspapers. The Boston Globe had a big ad looking for programmers for electronic games from Parker Brothers. And I had grown up a complete board game fanatic, played Monopoly and Risk and those games countless times. And so I basically got an interview, and I think got the job through sheer enthusiasm. And so joined a very small team doing electronic handheld games. And I worked for a few months on a prototype for electronic Monopoly, which never got published, that version anyway. And then the Atari hit. The Atari was already a thing, but Parker Brothers made the strategic decision to become a third-party developer. And I was in a small team. Jim McGinnis was our manager. Mark Lesser, who created the first two electronic handheld games ever, was on that group, and myself. And then we started hiring a few other people as well, but it was very small. We had to reverse engineer the Atari graphics chip because Atari considered it a trade secret and wasn't telling anybody. The only third-party company at this point was Activision, which was for Atari programmers who left. And they already knew how to program.
Atari really did dislike that whole idea that other people were able to sell cartridges for their hardware.
Right. They were unhappy with Activision, of course, losing their best talent. And then Parker Brothers, and then following on several other companies, started to get into the act. And reverse engineering the graphics chip was the first order of business. So we literally hired a company up the road to peel off the top layers and take micro photographs of it. And Mark Lesser, who was an electrical engineer and chip designer at Rockwell in the years before, started figuring out, how the circuitry might work in the graphics chip. And I wrote a disassembler for looking at existing cartridges, converting the machine code into assembly code, so we could at least look at assembly language. And started writing little experiments based on what Mark was finding. And so we took a few months basically to figure out how the thing worked. Funny story in that regard. The first photographs coming in from this company were very blurry. It's a very tiny chip. And so we thought maybe the road noise, going by that company was a problem. So Parker Brothers literally paid them to build a mercury bed to take photographs on so it would be more stable. Turned out one day the engineer there discovered the Scotch tape over the lens. And no problem. And so then I lucked out because once we figured out how the thing worked, and then, there were other people, not myself, negotiating with Lucasfilm to get the license. Parker Brothers is all about licensing in general for board games and everything else at that point. And they secured the Star Wars license. I wasn't involved in that per se. But then time came to do the first game, and I lucked out because Mark, who I got to be good friends with, was in the middle of a handheld project that they really wanted him to complete. And I was showing some promise with the disassembler and the other stuff. I was getting, known to be, fairly capable. And so they gave the project to me. And even though that was literally the first commercial program I wrote after college was The Empire Strikes Back.
So you were the hotshot young rebel pilot who got his opportunity.
That's right. A lot of enthusiasm. I had seen the movie, I think, 10 times by that point. And Sam Shellman, another employee there, became the artist and designer of the game. Although design, the programming and the design are so intertwined that, I was intimately involved in, like all the camera work, if that's the right word for it there, and the parallax view and stuff like that were things that I, programmed, and various people had ideas. It was a collaborative effort among more than even just Sam and I. But yeah, I mean, it was a good design, and I feel proud of the programming we did. It was, the Atari is a super limited system, and we were doing the best we could right out of the gate. I had never written an assembly language program before, never done graphics really. Like, I remember programs were small enough then that I would literally make a complete printout on paper in the morning and then stare at that while typing on the little VT100 terminal changes. And then I would, at the end of the day, I would make a complete printout and take it home and stare at it all night. It's basically 5 months of just complete immersion.
So when you started deciding what the game would be like, what scene of the movie you would try to adapt, I guess it was pretty clear that it would have to be one scene just because of the limitations of the hardware. You had each ROM cartridge, what was it like? Was it 4 kilobytes? Or how much did you have to work with?
It ended up being 4K. Some games were 2K and some were 4K kilobytes. This was 4K. The decision to do that scene from the movie, which sort of makes a lot of sense, that actually came like right before I joined the effort. So I wasn't even involved in that decision. Once we made the decision, then, I got intimately involved in discussions of how the snow speeder is going to work, how the walkers will work, all the various pieces of the game design, obviously. But the basic scene was set.
I would guess it was such an obvious choice. I mean, you had seen the movie often enough. Mm-hmm. I think that was the one scene everybody talked about first after he saw the movie, right? The highlight.
Yeah, I mean, nowadays, movies have incredible special effects. But when I first saw those Imperial walkers, in the movie theater, I was like, holy cow, look at this. This is unbelievable. So I think it was an obvious choice of scene to do the game from. And you could do then, Defender style flying, and, it sort of lent itself to the Atari, just the way the thing worked. Having the walkers, be these things that are incredibly hard to kill, make the game a little tedious. I think a lot of joysticks were broken playing that game, having to pound the thing 48 times. But then, we came up with the idea of having the weak spot, and then later the weak spot can turn into a smart bomb. And so there were some, I think, pretty creative elements that sort of made the game a little less tedious than it might have been if it was just straight shooting the walkers down and nothing else. I think the thing I'm most proud of the game, I think, is that they're shooting back at you and you're trying to hone in on a particular spot while flying at high speed across the screen. And so the sense of panic that sort of sets in when you play it, I think worked out pretty well. That's,
Yes, and just the speed, the game just feels so great to play. I mean, I still remember playing it in my parents' living room back in the day. It was simple, but it was so intense. And as simple as the graphics of the Atari were at the time, I mean, it was clearly the Battle of Hoth, right? I mean, it just worked on that level.
Yeah. I mean, Activision was pioneering, the most advanced use of the graphics chip. I tried and failed to be able to get the resolution of the walkers and the snow speeder down to every line. They changed graphics every other line, so they're a little bit blocky. Probably, on a second or third go around, might have been able to improve the graphics a little bit. But, I don't know if you know anything about the Atari programming, but it's an insane graphics chip. If you do nothing during the few milliseconds while the electron gun is painting down the CRT screen, and this only worked back in the days of, those old style cathode ray tubes. If you did nothing, you got vertical stripes on the screen. All the graphics is done by reprogramming graphics registers as the electron gun is scanning back and forth and down the display over and over again. It's nutty. There's no frame buffer, if that word rings a bell with people.
Were there any ideas you guys might have had during development which you simply weren't able to include because of time or hardware limitations?
There were two things that never made it in the game. One simple one was just like there's no scene where they come and blow up the power generator. Instead it's again this sort of endless thing where they just march on until you finally get defeated. And we want to put in the finale of that. And it was, tricky technically because there's no extra graphics resources in the same horizontal plane as the walkers to make use of. So it wasn't even clear how we could do it unless they were vertically separated from the walkers, which didn't really work, maybe, although it could have been down at the bottom of the screen. Anyway, so we never solved that. The other big one that got to actually be a little bit of a fight inside the company was the marketing department really, 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 really wanted the roping the walkers thing, which is, the big signature thing that happens. And we did too. I thought about it a bunch. We sort of tried to come up with ideas about, going back and forth and across the legs, and coming up with some kind of graphic technique. But, having the walkers fall down or whatever, there were a lot of issues that would be pretty hard to solve. I don't know if it would have been feasible or not, but we never really took it on. And there were some heated meetings, and I remember trying to diffuse some of them by saying, we'll get to it, we'll try later once we get the other stuff working, And then, of course, it never happened. And another thing funny is that some of the folks higher up in the company and in the marketing department, first couple months, I basically got the basic scene working and the walkers and the flying across whatever. And I was feeling like this thing is going to be good. It's coming out good. It's got a long way to go, but, felt good about it. The marketing department, people there were apoplectic. They said, this is no fun. I don't get it. It's terrible. Whatever. And then one day I was bored and I said, it's time to put some sound effects into the game. The game was silent till that point. And so I started playing with the sound chip and put in the explosions, whatever. The next time one of the people in marketing came to me, they said, what did you do to this game? It's great now. And they didn't know.
It was the same marketing department that killed the release of another Star Wars game, Ewok Adventure, which was done by one of your colleagues, I think. That's that story going around.
Yeah. Well, what happened, that was late 83 when I had already left Parker by that point to join Activision. But that was the Christmas glut, basically, where third-party development became, there was so much money to be made that just company after company after company jumped into it. And a lot of the games were crappy quality. And the whole, as you may know, the whole Atari market collapsed like overnight. And there were a lot of casualties of that. The Ewok game was not a bad game at all, as well as many of the others that never made it. I was at Activision working on a game, and I think Activision had about 60 Atari games in development at that point. And they ended up publishing less than 10 of them, I think, and mine didn't make the cut, so it was quite a spectacular collapse of the industry. And Nintendo rose out of the ashes a couple years later. Yeah. And they were smart. They locked down the whole third party immediately. That was the first order of business, was the legal lockdown, right?
Going back to Empire Strikes Back, were there any inspirations for the gameplay? You already mentioned Defender, because of the radar at the bottom of the screen.
Yeah. I mean, we wasn't trying to copy anything per se, but obviously games like Defender come to mind. We had a few arcade games in the office. One of them that was my favorite was Super Cobra, where you're a helicopter going horizontally through tunnels and stuff. And so, we were clearly in that genre. Most of those games, of course, have a lot of things buzzing around, or you're shooting ground targets or that sort of thing. And so the whole Walker piece was pretty unique in that genre, I guess. And the game was pretty simple. Having things like the smart bombs helped add some variety, whatever. So we weren't consciously trying to copy any one game, but it was clearly in that horizontal scrolling, airplane genre.
Were there any issues ever with Lucasfilm at the time, or do you remember anything about the approval process?
They were fairly hands-off. What did happen was when the game was essentially done, I and a manager flew to San Francisco, and I had the privilege of demonstrating the game to Ed Catmull, Ellie Ray Smith, and Lauren Carpenter, three of the gods of computer movie graphics, which I had ideas that maybe I would get into that business someday. I was, subscribing to Cinefex magazine and that sort of thing. And I was scared out of my wits showing the game. Lucas himself wasn't there, but these were the guys. I mean, Ed Catmull and Elvie Ray Smith ended up co-founding Pixar later, right? But it was funny that in retrospect, they had been through the early days of computer graphics, and they knew what the hardware was capable of and all that kind of stuff. And so they liked the game. They thought it was fine. Nobody got grilled about anything. They didn't request a single change,
Huh.
but they did review it and make they had the sign off on it.
That wasn't your only Star Wars game. I mean, can you give us just a really brief breakdown of your long career? You already mentioned Activision. I remember Mean 18 on the Amiga. So what came after Empire?
Yeah. So in short, I, again, joined Parker Brothers out of the blue. We did a second Star Wars game that wasn't quite so successful or quite so good, the Jedi Arena game. That was one that I kind of felt bad. There was an original design that you would control the little thing, whatever you call it, that spins around and shoots sparks or whatever, through the force, through kind of a magnetic push and pull. And I could never get anything acceptable to work, and then sort of turned it into kind of a breakout game or whatever. And it was not as popular. And then a few of us left Parker Brothers to join Activision because in retrospect, maybe, I don't know if I would do it again, but we, wanted to be more creative and just do our own games. At Activision, the game programmers were their own designers. It's like, here's a computer, have fun, see what you come up with. And so I did a game there that they kind of liked and wanted me to keep doing more work on, and I'd kind of run out of ideas, and then the whole Atari collapse happened and the game didn't get published. So I never published a game through Activision. I only worked on one. And then in early 84, I said, I'd seen a friend of mine from Parker Brothers days form his own little company. So I and a guy named Charlie Heath, who I met at Parker, and Ray Miller, who I read at Parker, although he didn't last too long in the company, maybe a year, formed Microsmiths. And around the time Ray left, Mark Lesser, who had stayed on at Parker to do a few other games, came and joined us. So it was me, Mark, and Charlie for a while. And for basically a decade, we had this little company that kind of specialized in doing ports of games, under contract from companies. They got an Apple II game that you needed on the Commodore or whatever. And in those days, for us anyway, a port literally meant just playing the game and rewriting it from scratch. We literally never even looked at the source code that they would give us.
Okay.
Because the games are simple enough, and we were proven right in that technique because we got the nod to do Little Computer People for the Atari ST, and Little Computer People for the Amiga was given to another developer, and he was doing it line by line translation and from different processors, and we just played the game and wrote it, and we did a better job quicker. So it worked out. Anyway, so we did some of that, but then I'd been an avid golfer as a teenager, and I really wanted to do a golf game. And somebody along the way said, the top-down stuff, screw that. Be the first to do a 3D looking down the fairway golf game. And so that's what became Mean 18. And it turned out that summer when we published Mean 18, 4 3D looking down the fairway golf games came out. 2 of them were not very good. The ones, Mean 18, was for the time pretty good game. And then Leaderboard, which then became Lynx.
Yeah, Leaderboard was the big one at the time. But I guess the Mean 18 did pretty well for you.
So I had a good run with that. I had done a course designer as part of it. And this is pre-internet, but people made their own golf courses in the game with using the designer that I packaged with the game. And there were hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of golf courses being traded around on bullet board systems. So that was sort of a big part of it. And so that was fun. And then basically by the early 90s, the game industry got away from this little 3-person outfit. I was never a good business person, and we did not ride the curve into the huge team type stuff that really started emerging in the 90s. And so after that, I ended up working as a programmer for other game companies.
Do you still get the old Atari out every once in a while?
No, I have a fondness for those things. I don't really play them much, but I have two Ataris from the old days, neither of which work. But a couple of years ago, I have two daughters and was talking to them about this, and they went and found an Atari that worked at some company a few towns away and gave it to me for Christmas. And so we had a day of playing a bunch of the old games. I don't think I've done it since then, but some of the games, they're so simple, but like the Activision ice hockey and tennis games and Stampede, I love those games. The games are obviously like unbelievable nowadays compared to then. I don't feel like I don't have enough interest to spend the time is the problem. So I actually enjoy like simpler games like that more than the gigantic things that take a big investment to get into. Probably the only exception is from time to time, I've gotten into real-time strategy games like Age of Empires and stuff, and played them a fair amount with friends because they're more social.
And is The Empire Strikes Back still your favorite Star Wars movie after all those years?
No, actually it isn't. My favorite movie is Rogue One.
Oh, really?
Yeah. I mean, the whole thing, my younger daughter is super into all of them, which is kind of fun. So I've seen the movies again a bunch of times with her and my older daughter too. So I have a lot of fondness for those movies for a lot of different reasons, including having worked on the game. But Rogue One, which tells the story of the finding of the plans for the Death Star and then ends literally at the moment that the original movie begins. I think it's a great movie. So that's my favorite.
Well, Rex, thank you very much for your time and shedding some light on the development and the whole background of creating the very first Star Wars video game. Great talking to you, and have a good time.
Yeah, good. You too. I appreciate your interest, and it's fun to relive some of the glory days. So nice chatting.
You can find more information about this podcast on pixelkino-podcast.com. Please be advised that our regular episodes are in German. Pixelkino is created and hosted by Christian Genzel and Heinrich Lenhardt, with music by Chris Hulsbeck.